So when the tide rolls out, I think there's going to be a lot of AI use cases, but I don't think it's going to be replacing literally everything we do. I think that if I had my ways, people would start realizing how you can use AI to help in just sort of the ways that we talked about, and not think about it as this like one sort of cheap solution that'll solve all of our problems, or this one cheap solution that'll get them rich. You really think about like, okay, how can we use it to help solve our problems? How can we use it to reason better? How can we use it to teach people, to make people more powerful?
Hi, I'm Rachel Chalmers, and this is Generationship, the podcast at the intersection of infrastructure and artificial intelligence. We are the generation that's exploring generative AI. We are a finite group of people with a finite set of resources, and we have to share this infrastructure. We have to find fair and ethical ways to do that. The first generation ship has already set sail. It's the planet Earth, and you and I are the crew. This show is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Elijah Ben Izzy to the show. Elijah has always enjoyed working at the intersection of math and engineering. More recently, he's focused his career on building tools to make data scientists and researchers more productive. At 2 Sigma, he built infrastructure to help quantitative researchers efficiently turn ideas into production trading models. At Stitch Fix, he ran the model lifecycle team, a team that focuses on streamlining the experience for data scientists to create and ship machine learning models. Elijah's now the CTO at Dagworks, which aims to solve the problem of building and maintaining complex data pipelines. In his spare time, he enjoys geeking out about fractals, poring over antique maps, and playing jazz piano. Eli, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You write about a lot of the cool projects that are happening at Dagworks. Let's talk about how to build a streaming chatbot. First up, why do we care? Why does streaming matter?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a parlor trick almost. The problem is that LLMs take a while to respond. They're doing a lot of complicated stuff, and there's sort of this inherent thing where as they take longer to respond, they can do a better job. So you kind of want to trick the user into keeping their attention there.
It's just like the little spinning donut on macOS.
Right, it's a classic UI trick. You want to keep the user there thinking about it so that they don't get sick of your thing and go to the competitor. So you have to give them something to think about. That said, the AI is not ready to give them sort of a well thought out thing, so it gives them the response piece by piece, right? And the nice thing is that transformer models, sort of self-attention, all these things are built to make this fairly easy to do so that you can actually start giving useful information back fairly quickly. So there's a metric in the AI world called time to first token. This is the idea that if you can sort of get a quick time to the first thing that the user sees, they'll be able to sort of engage with it better and they'll be able to get value sooner, right? And thus be less likely to sort of give up or be like, oh, this thing's broken, turn it off, turn it on again.
We are all dopamine junkies.
Exactly. And I think there's something else a little less quantifiable that streaming is just kind of fun. Like the first thing you do in programming is you print something and you're like, cool, it says hello world. And then you print something again and again and again. You do that in a while loop. And now you're like, okay, hello world 2, hello world 3. And it's like, that's more fun. So it's sort of a basic, like, same thing as animation is like, oh, things are moving on a screen. This is cool.
We have talked about Burr on the podcast before, but give us a refresher and tell us about some other tools that might be useful as we build our streaming chatbot.
Yeah, so Burr is interesting. It's really simple. It's just sort of a way of orchestrating functions. And we're starting to see this pattern show up in a ton of different places. So our other project, Hamilton, there's kind of an American history joke for those who are aware. Hamilton and Burr, two figures in American history. And there's all sorts of references buried in our examples and stuff. So there were just ways of orchestrating functions, right? And this is sort of the fundamental abstraction that we're finding really useful in the AI and ML world. Burr is specifically about sort of orchestrating functions by representing them as a state machine, meaning you do something, then modify the state, then decide what to do next, do something, and you sort of keep walking through that. And it turns out that can represent like a whole bunch of computations. So if you have an AI that's making decisions, you can ask it, okay, what model do I want to call? Then it'll think a bit, give the model back. Then you use that to choose which sort of thing to do next, and then call that model, and you can sort of keep going from there and build it out kind of as a flowchart, right? So it's nice for these things where you have actions which do something, these sort of tools where you can have your actions can call out to external things, and then you can sort of string them together nicely. And the thing is, without a system that models it formally, such as a state machine, this can get really hard to work with. So you have code that's calling other code, that's dependent on an AI. The AI is doing all sorts of crazy stuff because it's AI. You have no idea what's going on. Burr sort of helps in two ways. It helps you mentally model that, and it helps you track it and understand what happens, sort of plug it into different production concerns. So really, it's just a Python library that helps with all of this.
I really like your characterization of a state machine as a good abstraction for an agent, because I think it's easy, even for us who know what's going on under the covers, to think about agents as magic and as more powerful than they are. Thinking of them as state machine, input, output, flowcharts, gives us, I think, a much better handle on what's actually taking place. I think it's easier to reason about agents with that abstraction in mind.
Agreed. And I think that people like to sell agents as, oh, it's code that's writing code that's doing code stuff, or like AI that's doing all of this, and sell it as this whole sort of crazy system. But really, it's just, like, what do you do and do it? What do you do and do it? And the sort of interesting thing about an agent is that the system is deciding both what to do and how to do it. Whereas with a purely human in the loop type system, you'll have a human being the one deciding what to do and then the system actually doing it.
There was another cool Burr application you wrote that used the state machine abstraction to build what's essentially a time machine for debugging. Can you tell us more about that one?
Yeah, I was super stoked. So this was actually a request that came from a customer. They were building, so they're a robotics company, I think it's called Peanut Robotics. They were on sort of the Discord asking for help. And it turns out what they really wanted to do is they had this whole complicated set of interactions. They had all these different functions which were determining how the robot would interact with different things in its environment. They're using LLMs to do it. So it's kind of their sort of new revolutionary thing. But they really wanted to go back in time and figure out what it did at any given point, sort of rewind back, and then make a decision and see what would the counterfactual be. So we gave this ability. It's a pretty simple thing in the library, but Burr, to get into the nitty-gritty details, Burr has this capability to persist. So you can sort of persist your state and then load up from where you left off. And then with this time travel capability we built, you can persist your state, and instead of starting off from where you left off, you can start off from some number of steps back from where you left off, and then sort of fork the application. So if your application is running along, you're like, whoops, it made a mistake. You can go back in time, fork it, then even compare that to the next application, and thus allow you to sort of explore what happened, go back in time. And I think this is sort of a very critical way to debug, right? Because if you're making chaotic decisions, if something a few steps ago can influence what you're doing now, such as the robot, where not only is it sort of making these continual decisions, but it's also impacting the environment, which can impact future decisions. This is a really important thing to be able to really sort of iron down what that one point that was important was.
Yeah, I mean, it's magical enough with deterministic code, but as we move into this more stochastic world, being able to rewind and play out the different sliding doors futures is pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sets Burr apart from a bunch of other frameworks. Now, I say it and we release this podcast, and they're all going to build the same feature. It'll be really great. It's just a good feature to have. But most people, it's kind of interesting. Most people think about these chaotic systems and they don't even think about the question of what if I could go back in time and figure out what it was doing. The only question I think about is what if I could even know what it was doing?
Yeah.
So Burr, because it's sort of an opinionated, standardized way of writing it, kind of gives all of that to you for free. And that's what I'm really excited about.
What are some of the other exciting projects that people are building with Hamilton and Burr?
Yeah, so tons of stuff. So yeah, Burr, we're getting a bunch of cool things. Obviously, robotics application, streaming voice for support. So there's people who are streaming back stuff from OpenAI, then running that through a voice text model and doing that in a sort of fast enough way to have it be a live conversational response that I'm super excited about. There's a company doing IT support workflows. So sort of managing a complicated set of chains. This is like an agent, really, right? It's like saying, here are the things you can do, decide what to do. And then a lot of RAG workflows we've seen. So people like, so this gets onto the Hamilton side, people often ingest the documents using Hamilton. So build sort of a set of assets and like run through, stick something and say landscape, and then use Burr to manage the querying. They can keep track of conversation state. They can massage the prompt. They can sort of take that and filter out the stuff they find from the database and put it into the LLM. So that's kind of some of the cool uses in Burr. In Hamilton, there are like too many to count, and I'm really excited about it. So some of them, large enterprise using Hamilton for feature engineering, a lot of sort of large scale stuff on top of PySpark, which naturally gets to be very messy. Hamilton sort of helps you clean it. The British cycling team is using Hamilton to optimize their Olympic team, so to optimize sort of the velodrome conditions.
Okay, so they're not actually optimizing the cyclists themselves. I think that's outside the rules.
Yeah, I mean, the cyclists are the only people who can optimize the cyclists, but they're using the data. And Hamilton is the sort of core driver in that pipeline. If you ever go to gov.uk and enter feedback for any part of the government. It'll go through a Hamilton pipeline where they do NLP. We recently had a really cool set of sort of asynchronous text to SQL workflows. So this new startup, Ren.ai, is using Hamilton Async to sort of squeeze performance out of their text to SQL workflow. It's very core to their library. A really great one recently released in the Journal of Open Source Software is NatureF. This is a model to sort of understand the climate and the impact of building heights on climate, and then a whole bunch more. I could talk forever about this because these are all really exciting. But the high level is that recently there's been a whole sort of explosion in the capabilities of data technology. And I think that people are starting to see that they need a layer on top of that. We're calling this sort of assets, right? So if you're thinking about it, you've got like, okay, the data layer, you're messing around with Snowflake, you're sending data into and out of your data warehouse, and then sort of orchestration, you're thinking out like, okay, running jobs. But what you really want to be thinking about is this notion of assets, which we can map very cleanly in Hamilton and Burr to functions. So instead of thinking about sort of all the sort of building blocks of computers, you think at a high level of what are the functions you need, what are the data sets you want to compute, and what's your code actually doing. People are starting to pick up Hamilton and Burr to represent this. We're calling it the asset layer. Super excited about that. And it sort of feels like it's just growing quickly.
And most of what you're talking about is addressing Python devs, obviously, but that particular abstraction, the asset layer, is that something that you could conceivably sell to data scientists?
Oh, yeah. So I think half of the Hamilton users are data scientists, half of them are engineers. Burr, it's like the new AI engineers, which is like, we're data science, like same deal, right?
Yep.
Hamilton's a little easier to pitch to engineers, especially the asset layer. Data scientists tend to want to move quicker. They want to experiment versus data engineers and sort of ML engineers who want to be able to build something a little more reliable. So there's a constant sort of trade-off between how reliable you build and how well structured it is. We actually wrote a whole post about this trade-off. But at a high level, yes, the asset layer is sort of a good way of thinking about it for everybody. And especially if you get anything into production, it becomes really useful.
You seem to have quite a concentration of cool use cases in Britain. Do you have like some crazy boffin in London running around singing your praises?
So, yes, we do.
That's so cool.
It's really cool. And I like went to London. I did like a whole trip where I did a talk in Lithuania. I went to London and I met some of them. I think the consultants that started using Hamilton in England are in Manchester. It's sort of one group of consultants. They brought it to the British cycling team. Then somebody from the UK.gov interviewed with the consultancy, which asked them a question, and that's how they figured out about it. And it's like, kind of you look at like the same type of math as like viral spread.
Yes.
Right? You just see that like the initial point is really important to figure out where it is. So we have internal metrics that we look at, and England and the US far and away above the others, and then a lot in Europe too. I think there's also a thing where Europe is sort of tightly regulated, and if you're tightly regulated, you have less room to mess around.
Yeah.
So in thinking about things in terms of assets allows you to answer questions about assets, which is really what the government wants to know.
Yes.
Right. So understanding privacy stuff, GDPR, all of that is people think about that first and foremost in Europe, and in the US, that's often an afterthought. Hamilton allows you to both move quickly to sort of get the US speed of development that they've come to expect, and to trace through and understand what your code's actually doing. I think that's another reason for it.
Speaking of moving quickly, as a startup founder, do you worry about this massive AI hype wave? What's going to be left behind when it crashes, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't like hype a lot. I just find it to be like pretty insufferable. It kind of brings out the worst in people, right? As you throw money, then like all the vultures are attracted to the money. On the other hand, I'm actually like, I think that AI hype is probably going somewhere. And most hype cycles have turned into something, right? It just hasn't turned into exactly what we thought it was. So like, I feel like iOS and mobile stuff and cloud, that hype cycle is like, that's actually just how we program now. But yeah, I think it's going places. That said, I think that some parts will crash. I think the obsession of like talking as an interface is a little short-sighted, as in we've been spending years and years developing interfaces that are extremely well-tuned. So now to replace it all with conversational stuff is like, well, it works in some places, it doesn't work in others. Not that just magic replace all people thing. So when the tide rolls out, I think there's going to be a lot of AI use cases there. I mean, I use ChatGPT all the time. And if I use it, I'm like, okay, plenty of other people do it too. It's actually adding to our value, it's adding to the GDP. But I don't think it's going to be replacing literally everything we do. So I think it's somewhere in the middle, as most of these are. So when it rolls out, I think that obviously the people who are good at it and the tools that are actually useful, that aren't just built around how do I take advantage of AI and VC money pouring in, will still be used. And the ones that aren't useful will probably end up falling apart.
The one that makes me a little anxious, I guess, is thinking about how we are in an experimental phase, and a lot of these use cases is somewhat speculative. But, the fossil fuels we're using to underpin all of these technologies are not speculative, and they're really getting used up. Do you think the benefits will outweigh the harms long term?
I don't know, to be honest. The way that I think about it is there will always be use cases for energy. So whether we're burning through it in AI or burning through it in crypto, the thing that is most important is to get to a point where we actually have an abundance of energy and where energy is cheap. I think that is the core problem to humanity. And if we can solve that, world peace is within our grasp. So yes, I'm quite worried about that. Whether I think it's worth it, I don't know. I'm hopeful that use energy, come up with things. Those things help make us smarter. The fact that we're smarter can help find cheaper energy than we paid for the energy in droves in the beginning. On the other hand, it's just burning through energy, and it's all sort of funneling money to funny places. There are also cheaper ways to do energy. So I think if it forces us to optimize the society, maybe that's good, but that requires a bunch of incentives to align, which is complicated. So I don't really have a good answer to that other than, yes, I'm worried.
I don't think there is a really good answer to that. I think it's worth thinking about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this was my big complaint about crypto.
Yeah.
And be like, well, you're just using 2% of the world's energy for this. It's you're just moving money around. And they had some good answers. They're like, oh yeah, we can use factories in China that don't need to shut down overnight and we'll just burn through. So there is something to that, force it to be more efficient. But that might be a better argument in theory than in practice.
Yeah, I guess we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite sources for learning about AI?
Right, so I try to stay off LinkedIn because there's very little learning that goes on LinkedIn.
A lot of self-congratulation.
Yeah, self-congratulation, self-promotion. And I use it strictly to self-promote and to promote others in a transaction. Most of everything that goes on there is transactional. And learning is not I don't think, an inherently transactional activity like a lot of them do.
Yeah.
And then stuff from LinkedIn will be 3 weeks old digested Hacker News stuff.
Yep.
But sometimes you'll find interesting things at Hacker News. Really, I'll read papers if it's new and if I really want to learn. And honestly, going to ChatGPT to ask about it has been extremely helpful. ChatGPT and Claude. I found this to be the superpower use case for LLMs for me, where I can sort of do interactive learning. I'll start off at the lower level of understanding. So I really want to dig into transformers and attention sinks and all that. I'll ask it give me a lesson plan, tell me about these things, and then I'll sort of ask it more about a specific thing. Then the really cool thing is I'll ask it to evaluate my mental model. And I'll present, here's how I think it works. And I'll be that's right, this is not quite right. And that's a very great way of doing interactive understanding. So that's where I go to learn about AI.
Have you tested that in domains where you're pretty deep? Have you compared it to your own existing knowledge about certain fields?
That's a great idea. I haven't actually. I should. I think the problem is I get kind of bored of that very quick because it's
yeah.
So it's interesting. If I'm asking in TypeScript, where I'm good at, but I'm not an expert, right? It'll give me back some answers and I'll be like, wow, it's really smart. Then I'll ask about it in Python, where I've had way more experience, or Java, and it'll give me back answers. And I'm like, you don't know this thing that's new, right? This thing, or I could that's a classic beginner's mistake you just made. So I think that from that experience, I think it hasn't been super helpful in domains that you understand well. On the other hand, if you go into it thinking that you don't have any domains that you understand well, so go into it with humility, it'll probably teach you something.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my mental model for it now, in its spicy predictive text mode. It can get you up to mid. So if you're bad at something, it can get you up to average. But beyond average, it's still down to you. It's still down to you to understand nuance and edge cases and all of the subtlety that create real mastery. I think where these things are going to be really useful is bringing the bottom up and letting us build from a more sound foundation.
I think so. So I have a rant that I go on when I talk about AI stuff with fellow YC founders.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're all sick of it by now. But the basic idea is that an LLM can function as two things. It can be a database and it can be a reasoning agent. So it can sort of help you understand. It obviously uses database information to be as a reasoning agent. It's actually bad at both of these.
Yes.
But it's doing enough at both of these to provide use in some cases if you can sort of push it in the right direction. And it can be better at one and better at another depending on how you build it. So the database gets at that first, getting you from 0 to mid, right? Which I think is actually people spend a lot of time on that. And if we can get people to learn faster, then we can get them into expertise quicker and then make sort of more growth as humanity. But getting from mid to expert, I think there is still a use case for it to help you think about things. And maybe it's as simple as something that you call rubber ducky debugging.
Yeah.
Or Golden Lab debugging, my old mentor used to call it, where you like have some code, you start talking about it, and if you talk to a wall or a golden retriever who's just going to look back at you all cute, you'll start realizing the bugs you had. And it's sort of the first line of defense. So maybe it's the forcing you to think about it, and then the added sort of thinking back is helpful enough to help us learn in the more expert case.
And it's back to maps, isn't it? We've just invented maps. We've got this huge n-dimensional space of written perceptions about the world that this thing has been fed on. And it knows a little bit about how those parts are related and a little bit about how to navigate it. And yeah, it gives us sort of a crystal that we can catalyze other solutions around.
Absolutely. On a side note, have you ever asked it to create maps?
I have not. What happens?
It is utter junk. Even the best models aren't good at this. So it'll be like, okay, draw me a map of California. It'll have like 2 bays. It'll be like San Fran Popula.
I mean, honestly, I feel bad for these things if they are sentient, because we're keeping them in like a float tank, a sensory deprivation tank, and peppering them with questions. And the poor things really need to get out and touch grass. All right, I'm making you God Emperor of the solar system for the next 5 years. You get to decide how everything goes. What does the world look like?
So yeah, for the next 5 years, I'm excited to see like code standardization. I think this is a natural thing in compute when you build higher and higher level frameworks. The lower level pieces get more and more standard, right? Like here's the different operating systems we use. Here's the different programming languages we use. And I think on this asset layer, there's a lot of room for standardization. So not as God Emperor, but as startup founder, I would sort of push towards that. And that's kind of what we're working on, which will allow people to move faster as they come up with the right abstractions, especially in sort of the data space, understanding how data flows through and really be able to do stuff with the data as opposed to arguing about sort of the ways to structure code. I think that if I had my ways, people would start realizing how you can use AI to help in just sort of the ways that we talked about and not think about it as this like one sort of cheap solution that'll solve all of our problems or this one cheap solution that'll get them rich. You really think about like, okay, how can we use it to help solve our problems? How can we use it to reason better? How can we use it to teach people, to make people more powerful? So yeah, as God Emperor, I'd push it in that way. And then obviously as God Emperor, I would be very excited about sort of the 2 things that I'm really excited about, which is fusion and quantum compute. I think these are pretty essential in getting us to the next stage. So as God Emperor, I'd push towards abundant energy. I think that would be like, that is the sort of underlying problem that we're all facing. And I would absolutely love to see even more progress in that. I mean, obviously that there's so much money in fusion and quantum compute, but I think that's just like betting on the future is huge. And those are the sort of clear areas that we can improve in. And then finally, I would see if I could get people off social media and sort of push them back into the real world. I'm starting to realize that in the COVID era, we all started working from home, we got isolated, and I think it's kind of changed the way that we think quite a bit. So I think that there's a lot of strength in local communities, in connections among people, even online communities. But really, I think there's like a way that we've kind of like lost our way and are just sort of thinking in short-term crazy mode because of the sort of like volatility of the internet.
Yeah, it's fascinating how little Spanish influenza is directly mentioned in 1920s literature, and yet the whole Roaring 20s was clearly a post-traumatic response to both World War I and the huge wave of death in the Spanish flu.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I'm kind of worried that our reaction to COVID is just a Roaring 20s, but on the internet, which sounds a lot less fun. But hey, maybe I'm old school. Maybe Gen Z has this figured out.
Last question, my favorite. I'm giving you a generationship. We're going to the stars together. What are you going to name it?
I want to call it Morning Sun.
Oh, that's a good one.
Like the sort of New Horizons. It's a name of a street that is dear to me. And yeah, Morning Sun. It's the sort of promise of the future, right?
We will get that built for you right away, sir.
Please do.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Eli. It's been a pleasure.
It was a blast.
Good luck with everything.
All right.
Take care. That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest or if you know someone awesome I should interview, hook up with us online. We're available where all fine social medias are sold. This show is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor in developer-first startups. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com.